The air in the Sovereign was a currency all its own, thick with the scent of old money, aged leather, and the subtle, earthy perfume of truffles shaved over plates that cost more than a month's rent. It was an atmosphere of calculated silence, where the only acceptable sounds were the hushed rustle of bespoke suits, the delicate clinking of silver against bone china, and the low murmur of conversations that could shift global markets or seal fates in darkened corners. Crystal chandeliers hung from the coffered ceiling not like lights, but like frozen constellations, casting a cold, fractured brilliance over the mahogany-paneled walls. Through this gilded sanctuary moved Alara Vance, a ghost in a crisp, black uniform. Her movements were a study in efficiency, a ballet of self-effacement. She refilled water glasses before they were empty, cleared plates with a whisper of motion, and navigated the treacherous currents between tables with a grace born of necessity. To the titans of industry and the shadowy figures of power who dined here, she was less than a person. She was a function, a pair of hands that appeared and vanished, as unremarkable and necessary as the polished silverware she carried. Inside Alara, however, a universe of noise and memory raged. Each step on the plush Persian rug was a measure of her endurance, a silent testament to the life she had been forced to abandon. As she poured a vintage Bordeaux into the glass of a banking magnate, her hands were perfectly steady, but her mind was miles away, lost in the ghost scent of turpentine and linseed oil that no expensive perfume could ever truly wash away. She remembered the vibrant chaos of her family's art supply store, a place of joyous creation, where her father's booming laugh was the soundtrack to her childhood. She felt the phantom weight of a doctoral thesis she would never finish, its pages filled with groundbreaking research on art therapy and nonverbal communication. That world had been incinerated, reduced to ash by a single, brutal act of greed. The men who had come, with their quiet threats and predatory smiles, had not just bankrupted the business, they had stolen her father's voice, the stress of their extortion racket triggering a massive stroke that left him trapped in a silent, motionless prison. Now the sterile, antiseptic smell of his long-term care facility was the scent that defined her reality, and the exorbitant monthly bills were the chains that bound her to this life of servitude at the Sovereign. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of this gilded cage. But first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community for stories where the overlooked find their voice. Her invisibility in this opulent theater was a weapon of its own, a shield she had painstakingly crafted. The patrons of the Sovereign were accustomed to being seen, to being the center of every room they entered. They craved attention, fed on deference, and were therefore blind to anyone they deemed beneath their notice. Alara used this blindness to her advantage. She became an expert observer, a silent chronicler of the secret lives of the powerful. She learned to read the subtle tells of a lie in the twitch of a powerful man's eye, to decipher the language of a clandestine deal in the space between handshakes. She absorbed everything, filed it away, her mind a fortress of details that no one suspected she possessed. This quiet, unassuming waitress was not broken. She was dormant, a coiled spring of intellect and righteous anger, waiting for the precise moment of pressure that would release its formidable power. Her secret skill, the one she had been honing since childhood and had nearly perfected in her academic pursuits, was a language that required no sound. She could speak through images, weave narratives in charcoal and ink, and build bridges of understanding with the stroke of a pen. It was a gift that had once been the focus of her promising career, a method to reach children locked away by trauma and adults silenced by neurological damage. Now its only application was in the quiet hours she spent at her father's bedside, drawing pictures on a small whiteboard to tell him about her day. to ask him if he was in pain, to remind him of the vibrant life they once shared. His eyes, the only part of him that could still move with purpose, would follow the lines she drew, and in their depths she would find the flicker of connection that fueled her through another grueling shift. It was a sacred, silent conversation, a lifeline of love and memory that kept them both from drowning in the depths of their shared tragedy. This ability was the last, untarnished piece of the woman she was meant to be. The heavy oak doors of the Sovereign swung open, and a palpable chill swept through the dining room, silencing the already hushed conversations. It was not a draft of cold air but a shift in the gravitational center of the room. Marco Bellini had arrived. He moved not like a man entering a restaurant, but like a king returning to his court. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit the color of midnight, a garment that seemed less like clothing and more like a suit of armor. His face was a mask of cold control, his eyes missing any trace of warmth as they scanned the room, cataloging, assessing, and dismissing everyone in his path. The staff tensed, their professional smiles tightening at the edges. The restaurant owner, a man who intimidated senators, materialized at his side with a posture of near-total deference. Marco Bellini was the apex predator in this ecosystem of power, the silent partner behind countless legitimate facades, and the feared head of the city's most ruthless criminal syndicate. His presence was an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, and everyone in the room could feel its suffocating weight. Trailing in his wake like a small, forgotten satellite pulled along by an immense planet was a young boy. This was Leo, Marco's son. Where his father was a sharp, commanding presence, Leo seemed to be trying to fold in on himself, to vanish into the fabric of his own slightly too large blazer. His eyes were wide, darting away from the overwhelming sensory input of the room. The glare of the chandeliers, the cacophony of competing colognes, the intimidating energy of the powerful patrons. In his hands he clutched a small, worn sketchbook and a single pencil, holding them not as a hobby, but as a shield. He was a ghost at his father's side, an inconvenient postscript to a legacy of dominance. Marco led his party to a private alcove, the most secluded and prestigious table in the restaurant, gesturing for his son to sit in a chair in the corner, away from the main conversation, effectively placing him in social exile. The boy complied without a word, immediately opening his sketchbook, his entire world shrinking to the comforting emptiness of the blank page before him. Marco seated himself opposite a ruthless-looking associate, a man whose smile was as sharp and dangerous as broken glass. They were here to celebrate a new acquisition, a real estate deal that had cleaned up an old, struggling neighborhood, paving the way for luxury high-rises. The conversation was a river of corporate jargon and veiled threats, a language of power Ilara knew all too well. As she approached the alcove to offer water, she saw Marco gesture dismissively toward the corner where his son sat, lost in his drawing. The gesture was small, a flick of the wrist, but it was loaded with a universe of contempt. It was a motion designed to erase his own child from existence, to sweep him away like an inconvenient crumb on the table of his immense ambition. Ilara's heart clenched, a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. She had seen casual cruelty in this restaurant before, but this was different. This was a father's public disavowal of his own son, a quiet act of emotional violence that was more chilling than any shouted threat. The associate glanced over at Leo, his expression a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Marco leaned in, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, yet loud enough for Ilara to hear as she stood frozen just a few feet away. The words were delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel, each one designed to cut away the perceived weakness his son represented. He looked directly at his business partner, a faint, cruel smirk playing on his lips as he delivered the final, devastating blow to his son's dignity. "He's in his own world," Marco Bellini said, the words dripping with a profound and chilling disappointment that echoed in the opulent silence of the alcove. He then added, a final twist of the knife. "Some legacies are disappointing." Though Leo did not look up from his sketchbook, Ilara saw his small shoulders flinch, a barely perceptible tremor that betrayed the wound the words had inflicted. In that moment, the simmering rage within Alara, the fury she had kept locked away for years, began to solidify. The image of her own father, silenced by this man's boundless greed, flashed in her mind, his vibrant, laughing face superimposed over Leo's quiet, lonely form. The injustice was no longer a memory. It was a living, breathing entity, and its name was Marco Bellini. The shift bell chimed, a small, electronic sound that usually signaled a 15-minute reprieve from the suffocating performance of servitude. For Ilara, it was a chance to retreat into the anonymous quiet of the staff locker room, to breathe air that wasn't heavy with the scent of power and excess. But tonight, the chime felt different. It felt like a summons. Her gaze was drawn, as if by an invisible thread, back to the alcove where the small boy sat, a solitary island in a sea of his father's making. The sketchbook in his hands was more than paper. It was a lifeboat, and she could see, with the trained eye of a specialist, that he was desperately trying not to drown. An internal war waged within her. To approach him would be to break the cardinal rule of her employment, remain invisible. It was a transgression that could cost her the job she so desperately needed, the very job that kept her father alive. Yet to walk away felt like a betrayal of something deeper, a betrayal of the frightened child she had once been, and a betrayal of the core belief that had once guided her life's ambition. That art was a bridge, a sanctuary for those who could not find their voice in the noise of the world. The risk was immense, a gamble with the fragile stability she had fought so hard to maintain, but the image of Leo's hunched shoulders, a silent scream for connection, was a force she could not ignore. She made her decision in the space of a single, controlled breath. Ignoring the call of the break room, she moved with practiced stealth toward the service station, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her fingers, nimble and sure, closed around a clean, crisp linen napkin and a simple black ballpoint pen from the reservation podium. It was a pathetic substitute for the charcoal sticks and textured paper of her past, but it would have to do. The tools were not the point. The language was. As she approached the corner where Leo sat, she felt the oppressive weight of Marco Bellini's presence, even with his back partially turned. It was like walking into a magnetic field, a force that repelled all who were deemed unworthy. She could feel the eyes of other staff members on her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and alarm. She was breaking protocol in the most audacious way imaginable. But as she drew closer to the boy, the noise of the restaurant, the fear of her employer, and the crushing weight of her own circumstances began to recede. All she saw was the blank page in his sketchbook, and the infinite, lonely universe contained within the small boy holding it. Her purpose, for the first time in years, was not about survival, but about connection. It was a terrifyingly familiar feeling, a ghost of the woman she used to be, stepping out from the shadows. She did not speak. Words would have been a clumsy intrusion, a foreign language in the silent world he had so carefully constructed around himself. Instead, she knelt, not directly in front of him, but slightly to the side, a non-threatening presence entering his periphery. She placed the linen napkin on the small, unoccupied portion of the table beside him. The gesture was slow, deliberate, a silent question. For a long moment, Leo didn't react. His entire focus was on the pencil in his hand, on the intricate, geometric patterns he was shading onto the page. Hilara waited, her own breathing shallow, matching the quiet rhythm of the room. She could feel the seconds stretching into an eternity, the risk she was taking amplifying with each passing moment. Then, slowly, his eyes flickered from his sketchbook to the white square of linen she had offered. He didn't look at her face, not yet. His gaze was fixed on the offering, his mind processing this unexpected variable in his controlled environment. Ilara held her breath, knowing this was the most critical juncture. She had offered an invitation into a shared space. Whether he accepted it or not would determine everything. The fate of her job, and perhaps something far more significant, hung suspended in that fragile, silent moment. With a hand that was as steady as a surgeon's, Ilara uncapped the pen. The soft click was the only sound in their small bubble of silence. She began to draw. She didn't draw something complex or showy. That would have been an assertion of dominance, an adult showing off for a child. Instead, she drew a single, simple object from his world. She replicated the small, intricate spiral he was sketching in the corner of his own page. It was an echo, a reflection, a visual way of saying, "I see you. I see what you are doing, and I understand it." The black ink bled softly into the fine weave of the napkin, the line imperfect but clear. It was a gesture of pure empathy, a translation of her doctoral research into a single, potent act. Communication wasn't about speaking, it was about being heard, about having one's own language validated and returned. She finished the small spiral and then lifted the pen, leaving the rest of the napkin a vast, empty space, an open invitation for him to respond, to continue the conversation she had just begun in a language he so clearly understood. Leo's pencil stilled. For the first time all evening, the ceaseless, rhythmic motion of his hand came to a complete stop. His head tilted, a subtle shift, as his eyes fully focused on the spiral Elara had drawn on the napkin. It was an exact mirror of his own creation, a perfect, silent echo. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, surprise, curiosity, perhaps even a sliver of recognition. He looked from her drawing back to his own, then back again, his mind tracing the connection she had just forged between their two separate worlds. He slowly lifted his gaze from the napkin, past her hand, and for the first time, his eyes met hers. They were deep, intelligent eyes, not lost or vacant as his father had implied, but overwhelmed, searching for a safe harbor in a storm of sensory overload. In her calm, steady gaze, he seemed to find it. He saw no pity, no judgment, no demand for a verbal response. He saw only a quiet understanding, a shared language that needed no words. The invisible wall he had built around himself, a fortress of solitude, suddenly had a small, open gate. Then, the miracle happened. With a tentative, almost hesitant motion, Leo reached out with his pencil. He did not speak, did not make a sound. He simply touched the tip of his pencil to the linen napkin beside her drawing. He responded. He drew a line, extending from her spiral, and at the end of it he sketched a small, stylized bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was a breathtaking response, a leap of creative trust. He had taken her echo and turned it into a dialogue. Elara felt a surge of profound emotion, a warmth that spread through her chest, pushing back the years of cold resignation. She answered his bird with a tree, its branches reaching up to meet the sky. He added a moon hanging above the branches. She drew a small, winding river at the base of the tree. He filled the river with tiny, swimming fish. Together, in the hushed, opulent cathedral of power and greed, they created a world. It was a silent symphony of ink and graphite, a beautiful, intricate conversation that was more meaningful than any of the billion-dollar deals being whispered around them. They were no longer a waitress and a lonely boy. They were co-creators, architects of a shared sanctuary. The final touch was his. After she drew a small house nestled among the roots of the tree, Leo paused. He looked at the complete picture they had made together, a harmonious landscape born of a quiet understanding. Then, with a focus that was absolute, he drew two stick figures standing at the door of the house, holding hands. He looked up at her one last time, and a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. It was not a small, polite smile. It was a sunrise. It was a genuine, unburdened expression of pure joy that transformed his entire being, chasing away the shadows of neglect and loneliness. It was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing Elara had ever seen. In that single, breathtaking moment, the boy was not a disappointment. He was not a flawed legacy. He was brilliant, he was seen, and he was happy. The sound of that silent joy was louder than any shouted word, a testament to a connection that his father's world of power and money could never comprehend or purchase. It was a perfect, fragile moment of pure human connection, a masterpiece painted on a throwaway piece of linen. From across the room, Marco Bellini saw it all. He had been holding court, his voice a low, confident rumble as he outlined the final details of his latest conquest to his associate. But some primal instinct, some flicker of movement in his periphery, drew his attention to the corner where he had exiled his son. He didn't see the drawing. He didn't see the art or the connection. He saw only the smile on Leo's face, a smile he himself had not been able to elicit in years. And he saw the source of it, a lowly waitress, kneeling at his son's table as if she were an equal. The blood in his veins turned to ice. It was not warmth or pride he felt, but a surge of pure, unadulterated humiliation. This nobody, this servant in a cheap uniform, had succeeded where he, Marco Bellini, had failed. She had unlocked a part of his son he had deemed unreachable, and she had done it in full view of his world, in front of the very men he needed to impress with his absolute control and power. The interaction was not an act of kindness in his eyes. It was a public indictment of his fatherhood, a spotlight on the one part of his life he could not dominate into submission. His associate followed his gaze, a predatory smirk touching his lips. He saw the scene and misinterpreted it, thinking it a moment of weakness he could exploit. The man leaned in, his voice a slick whisper of insinuation, a subtle jab at the Don's carefully constructed facade of invincibility. This observation, meant to be a simple comment, landed on Marco's ego like a physical blow. The quiet waitress had not just connected with his son, she had given his rivals ammunition. She had exposed a chink in his armor, a vulnerability he had spent a lifetime concealing. The cold fury in Marco's eyes intensified, hardening into something dark and resolute. The smile on his son's face was no longer a sign of joy. It was a symbol of his own failure, a public stain on the Bellini name. And the waitress, the insignificant catalyst for this entire spectacle, had just signed her own professional death warrant. Her simple act of human decency had been twisted in the crucible of his pride into an unforgivable act of defiance. Alara, lost in the small, beautiful world she had co-created, was oblivious to the storm gathering across the room. She gently folded the napkin, the drawing safely tucked inside, and offered it to Leo. His small fingers closed around it, holding it like a precious treasure. As she rose to her feet, the spell was broken. The harsh reality of the sovereign crashed back in on her. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of powerful men, the weight of 1,000 unspoken rules. She gave Leo a small, conspiratorial nod and turned to walk away, her heart lighter than it had been in years, a dangerous and unfamiliar sensation. She had not even taken 2 steps before a junior manager, his face pale with anxiety, intercepted her. His voice was a strained whisper, tight with fear. He informed her that Mr. Bellini required her presence immediately, in the service corridor behind the main kitchen. The words were polite, but the tone was an omen. The warmth in Alara's chest instantly evaporated, replaced by the familiar, chilling dread that had been her constant companion for years. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The walk to the service corridor felt like a death march. The opulent warmth of the dining room gave way to the cold, sterile efficiency of the restaurant's backstage. The air here smelled of bleach and anxiety. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the stainless steel surfaces and scuffed linoleum floors. It was a world away from the curated perfection of the front of house, a place where illusions were stripped away, leaving only the stark mechanics of service. Marco Bellini was waiting for her there, standing beneath one of the buzzing lights. He was alone, and the absence of his entourage somehow made him more menacing. Here, stripped of the trappings of his power, his personal authority was absolute. He was not a patron. He was a predator in his natural habitat, a place of shadows and quiet threats. He watched her approach, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury, his stillness more terrifying than any overt display of anger could ever be. He did not raise his voice. Shouting was for men who needed to prove their power. Marco's power was so absolute that it required only a whisper. His voice was a quiet, lethal thing, the sound of steel sliding from a sheath. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and she felt his gaze dissecting her, dismissing her, erasing her. The words, when they came, were delivered with a chilling precision, each one a perfectly aimed dart designed to sever her from her livelihood. He accused her of making a spectacle, of overstepping her station, of daring to insert herself into his family's affairs. He spoke of her as if she were an insect he had found crawling on his plate, a disgusting and unwelcome intrusion into his pristine world. The professional mask Ilara wore, the one that had survived countless insults and indignities, began to crack under the sheer venom of his quiet, controlled rage. She felt a tremor in her hands, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach as she realized the full extent of his wrath. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble for survival. She thought of her father, of the next payment due to the care facility, of the crushing weight of the debt that anchored her to this life. A desperate apology formed on her lips, a plea for understanding, a futile attempt to explain that her actions were born of empathy, not malice. But before she could utter a single word, he cut her off with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He pulled out his phone, a sleek black monolith, and made a single brief call. He didn't even say hello. He simply spoke the name of the restaurant owner and then delivered his verdict with the cold finality of a judge sentencing a criminal to death. The conversation lasted no more than 10 seconds. When he hung up, he slid the phone back into his pocket and looked at her one last time, his eyes devoid of any human emotion. The owner, he informed her, would be out in a moment to finalize the details of her termination. She was no longer an employee, she was a loose end, a piece of trash to be disposed of. As he turned to leave, a final, casual remark slipped from his lips, a parting shot meant to underscore his absolute power and her complete insignificance. He was talking to himself as much as to her, a justification for the cleanup he had just performed. He mentioned his new real estate acquisition, the source of his celebration tonight, boasting about how he had finally purged the last of the decay from the old Amber Creek district, turning a blight into a beacon of profitable luxury. The name hit her like a physical blow, a lightning strike that arced through her entire body, connecting a past she had tried to bury with the horrifying present. Amber Creek. The name of the neighborhood where her family's store had stood. The place where her father's laughter once echoed, where the scent of paint and possibility had filled the air. It was the place where their lives had been systematically dismantled by faceless predators demanding protection money. The place where their dreams had been extinguished by a ruthless, unseen hand. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, deafening clang. The world around her seemed to slow down, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights amplifying into a roar. This man, this impeccably dressed monster standing before her, was not just a cruel father or an arrogant patron. He was the architect of her family's destruction. The quiet threats, the predatory smiles of the men who had visited their shop, the endless, sleepless nights her parents had endured, it all led back to him. The stroke that had silenced her father was not a random act of biology. It was the final, brutal consequence of this man's casual, thoughtless greed. He had not just cost her a job tonight, he had stolen her entire world years ago and had not even bothered to remember the names of his victims. He was the ghost that had haunted her life, and she had just served him his wine. The realization was so profound, so devastating, that it transcended fear, burning it away completely. In its place, something new and terrifyingly powerful began to form. The simmering rage she had suppressed for years, the grief she had carried like a shroud, did not erupt in a fiery explosion. Instead, it underwent a chemical change. crystallizing under the immense pressure of this revelation into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. The trembling in her hands stopped. Her breathing, which had been shallow and panicked, became slow and deliberate. The waitress, the invisible, self-effacing servant, died in that sterile corridor. In her place stood someone else, someone forged in the crucible of profound injustice. She was no longer a victim reacting to her circumstances. She was a survivor with a target. The despair that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a singular, clarifying purpose. It was not vengeance she wanted. It was a reckoning. It was the complete and total annihilation of Marco Bellini's world, built piece by piece, just as he had dismantled hers. The restaurant owner arrived, his face a mask of pained apology and fear. He couldn't meet her eyes as he mumbled something about her final paycheck, about security escorting her from the premises. Alara barely heard him. She looked past the trembling manager, her gaze fixed on the retreating back of Marco Bellini as he disappeared back into the warm, gilded world of the dining room. He had forgotten her already, a minor annoyance swiftly dealt with. He had no idea that his greatest mistake was not in firing her, but in saying that one single name. He had given his ghost a face, and in doing so, he had armed her with a weapon far more potent than any of his hired thugs or corrupt officials. He had armed her with the truth. As she was led through the back of the kitchen, past the averted eyes of her former colleagues, she felt no shame, no despair. She felt only the cold, steady hum of a machine that had just been switched on. Her mind, once a repository of art history and therapeutic techniques, was already recalibrating, turning into a war room where the first strategies of a long and patient campaign were being drawn. She stepped out of the back alley entrance and into the cold night air. The city lights of New York blurred around her, a chaotic symphony of life and ambition. For most, it was just another night in the metropolis. For Alara, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a declaration of war whispered into the indifferent wind. The grief for her past was still there, a permanent ache in her soul, but it was no longer a weight holding her down. It was fuel. She thought of Leo's smile, a small beacon of purity in a world of corruption. She thought of her father, trapped in his silent prison. These were the things she would fight for. She pulled out her phone, its screen a stark light in the darkness of the alley. Her fingers scrolled through her contacts, past the numbers for temp agencies and low-wage employers, until she found a name she had not thought about in years, a name from another lifetime. Arthur Pinter. The grizzled investigative journalist, a friend of her father's, the man who had once tried and failed to build a case against the city's real estate predators. He was retired now, beaten down by a system that protected men like Bellini. But Alara knew he still had the fire, the knowledge, the righteous anger. All he needed was a spark. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, each ring a hammer blow against the silence of the night. She almost lost her nerve, the sheer audacity of what she was about to do threatening to overwhelm her. Then, the image of Marco Bellini's dismissive sneer flashed in her mind, and her resolve hardened like steel. A gruff, sleepy voice answered on the other end, thick with the gravel of years of cigarettes and cynicism. It was him. Alara took a deep, steadying breath. The voice that came out of her was not the voice of a timid waitress. It was calm, precise, and devoid of any hesitation. She introduced herself as the daughter of a man he once knew, a man whose life had been ruined. She didn't wait for his response, for the questions she knew would come. She cut straight to the point, delivering the one sentence she knew would capture his attention, the one sentence that would pull him back from the brink of his weary retirement and into the heart of the fight she was about to begin. The war for justice had just found its first soldier, and the opening shot had been fired in the darkness of a lonely city alley. Arthur Pinter lived in a world constructed from paper and regret. His small, rent-controlled apartment on the Lower East Side was a fortress against the digital age, its walls lined not with bookshelves, but with teetering stacks of yellowed newspapers, overflowing file boxes, and dog-eared legal pads filled with a spidery, furious script. The air was thick, with the scent of stale coffee, aging newsprint, and the faint, metallic odor of a radiator that had been fighting a losing battle against the city's winters for half a century. When Elara knocked, the sound was absorbed by the sheer volume of paper, and she had to knock again, harder, the sound of her knuckles against the peeling paint of the door, a stark intrusion into the dusty silence. When he finally opened it, he looked less like a retired journalist and more like a ghost who had forgotten how to haunt, his face a roadmap of cynicism and exhaustion, his eyes clouded with the weary resignation of a man who had stared into the abyss for too long and seen it stare back with utter indifference. He was the antithesis of Marco Bellini's polished, predatory world, a relic of an era when truth was believed to be a weapon, before he learned that some dragons were simply too big to slay. He listened to her story with the practiced patience of a man who had heard 1,000 tales of woe, his expression unchanging, his posture slumped in a worn armchair that seemed to be slowly consuming him. Elara did not plead or cry. She presented her case with the cool, methodical precision of an academic laying out a thesis. She spoke of the sovereign, of the whispered conversations she had catalogued, of the subtle dynamics of power she had observed. She detailed the structure of Bellini's inner circle, the names of his lieutenants, the types of deals they celebrated with $1,000 bottles of wine. She was not just a grieving daughter. She was a highly skilled intelligence operative who had been embedded in the enemy's command center for years without their knowledge. Arthur listened, a flicker of professional interest cutting through the fog of his apathy. He had seen this before, the righteous anger of a victim, but he had never seen it paired with such a formidable analytical mind. He saw the raw data she possessed, the years of passive observation that could be weaponized with the right guidance. Still, he was hesitant, the old wounds of his past failures aching like phantom limbs. He remembered the last time he went after Bellini, the threats that had been whispered to him over the phone, the way his sources had mysteriously vanished, the way the system had closed ranks to protect one of its own. He had lost his job, his reputation, and a significant piece of his soul in that fight. He tried to warn her off, to explain the sheer scale of the Leviathan she was proposing they hunt. He spoke of Bellini's influence, a web of corruption that extended into the highest echelons of the city's political and legal systems. He told her it was a suicide mission, that the man was untouchable, a king in a city that worshipped power above all else. But Elara was immovable. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. Its edges softened with time. It was her father, years before the stroke, his arms covered in paint, his face split by a wide, booming laugh as he stood in the doorway of their beloved store. She slid the photo across the cluttered coffee table. It was not an appeal to pity. It was a statement of fact. This was the human cost. This was the debt that had to be paid. Arthur stared at the photograph, and something within him, a pilot light he thought had been extinguished decades ago, sputtered back to life. He saw not just Elara's father, but all the other faces, the countless small business owners, the families, the lives that had been ground into dust beneath the wheels of Bellini's relentless ambition. He had spent years trying to forget them, to numb the guilt of his failure with cheap whiskey and the comforting embrace of cynicism. But looking at that photograph, and then into the diamond-hard eyes of the young woman sitting opposite him, he realized that forgetting was a luxury he had not earned. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting, and walked over to a large, dusty filing cabinet in the corner of the room, a tombstone for his dead career. He pulled open a drawer labeled Bellini, and the screech of metal on metal was the sound of an old war being declared anew. He pulled out a thick, forgotten file, blowing a layer of dust from its cover. His voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer weary. It was the gravelly, determined voice of the journalist he used to be. The hunt for evidence had officially begun. Their first forays were a descent into a bureaucratic hell, a labyrinth designed to protect men like Marco Bellini. They spent weeks in the cavernous, echoing halls of the city's municipal archives, a place where history went to be forgotten. The air was cold and smelled of acidic paper decay, the silence broken only by the ghostly whir of microfilm readers and the soft, rhythmic turning of brittle pages. Alara's days became a grueling cycle of sifting through property deeds, incorporation papers, and zoning variances, her eyes burning from the strain of deciphering faded ink and dense legalese. Each document was a dead end, a perfectly constructed lie. Shell corporations were nested within other shell corporations, a series of Russian dolls that led them through a maze of offshore accounts and phantom board members. Bellini's name was nowhere to be found, his presence a ghostly hand that had shaped the city's landscape without ever leaving a fingerprint. The sheer, impenetrable scale of his operation was designed to induce despair, to make any challenger give up from sheer exhaustion. There were nights when Alara would return to her small, empty apartment, the weight of their failure pressing down on her, and for a moment she would feel the cold tendrils of hopelessness wrapping around her heart. She would sit in the dark, the silence amplifying the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the image of Bellini's cruel, dismissive face would swim in her vision. She would feel the crushing reality of her situation, a fired waitress and a disgraced journalist against a criminal empire worth billions. The fight felt impossible, a fool's errand. But then, her gaze would fall upon the small whiteboard she kept by her bed, the one she used to communicate with her father. She would remember the way his eyes would light up when she drew a picture of their old store, the ghost of a memory flickering in the depths of his trapped consciousness. The thought of him, of the life that had been stolen from him, was a fire that burned away the despair. It was not just her fight, it was his. And she would not, could not, let him down. Her resolve would harden once more, and she would be back at the archives the next morning, fueled by a righteous fury that was more potent than any amount of sleep. Arthur, meanwhile, was her strategist, her mentor in the dark arts of exposing the corrupt. He taught her to see the patterns in the chaos, to read the negative space in the documents. He explained Bellini's psychology, his blend of meticulous paranoia and arrogant pride. He was a man who trusted no one, who kept his real secrets close, but who also believed himself to be so far above the law that he would never imagine someone like her could be a threat. They began to focus not on the official records, but on the whispers, the rumors, the ghosts of Bellini's past. Arthur started making calls to old, forgotten contacts, dredging up names from cases that had gone cold decades ago. He was searching for a crack in the fortress wall, a single, disgruntled soldier who might hold a key. Most of his calls were met with hung-up phones or fearful silence. The name Bellini still held a terrifying power in the city's underworld. But then, one name surfaced, a whisper from a retired beat cop who owed Arthur a favor from long ago. Frank Costello, a bookkeeper, a man who had been Bellini's numbers guy in the early days, before the empire became a legitimate-looking corporation, a man who had been cast aside when he was no longer useful. Finding Frank Costello was like hunting a phantom. He was a man living entirely off the grid, a ghost haunted by the fear of his former employer. He had no credit cards, no social security footprint, no digital trail. Arthur's contact gave them a general neighborhood, a small, forgotten enclave of walk-up apartments in Queens, a place where people went to disappear. It took them 2 weeks of patient, painstaking work, of showing Frank's old driver's license photo to bodega owners and laundromat attendants, before they finally found him. He was living in a cramped, third-floor apartment under a false name, his face etched with the permanent anxiety of a man who spends his life looking over his shoulder. The fear in his eyes when he saw them at his door was a visceral, palpable thing. He tried to slam the door in their faces, his body trembling, but Alara was faster, her hand holding it open, not with force, but with a quiet, desperate plea. Arthur stood back, knowing this was her moment. A grizzled ex-reporter would only amplify the man's fear. This required a different touch. Alara did not threaten him or offer him money. She understood that his fear was deeper than any threat, and his soul was too wounded for any bribe. Instead, she spoke to him in the language she knew best, the language of shared humanity. She told him her name, and then she told him her father's name. She spoke of their small art supply store in Amber Creek, of the smell of turpentine, and the sound of her father's laughter. She described the men who had come, the fear in her mother's eyes, the way the light had slowly drained from their lives. She did not accuse. She simply testified. She pulled out the worn photograph of her father and held it out for him to see, a tangible piece of the life his numbers had helped to destroy. She was using the core principle of her abandoned doctoral thesis, creating a bridge of empathetic connection where words and logic failed. She was not asking him to be a hero. She was simply asking him to see the face of the man whose suffering he had recorded as a neat entry in a ledger. Frank Costello stared at the photograph, his breathing ragged. For years, the names in those books had been abstractions, meaningless entries in a column of profit and loss. But now, one of them had a face. One of them had a daughter with eyes full of a pain he recognized, the pain of a life irrevocably broken. He looked at Ilara, and for the first time in decades, the fear in his eyes was overshadowed by a flicker of something else: shame. He finally broke, the story spilling out of him in a torrent of whispered confessions. He told them that Bellini, in his ultimate paranoia, never trusted computers with the real records. The early extortion rackets, the ones that built his empire, were all recorded by hand in a set of 3 leather-bound ledgers. He called them his, quote, founding documents. And he told them about Bellini's one sentimental weakness: the first office he ever rented, a small, squalid room above a bakery, in the very neighborhood he had systematically destroyed. The building was now a high-end storage facility, but Bellini still owned that specific unit, a dusty, forgotten shrine to his own ruthless ascent. Frank was certain the ledgers were there, locked away in a place no one would ever think to look. The storage facility was a modern, climate-controlled fortress, a sterile mausoleum for the possessions of the wealthy. It was a place of silent corridors, anonymous steel doors, and a network of security cameras that watched every move with a cold, unblinking eye. A frontal assault was impossible. They needed a key, a way to belong inside that sterile environment without raising suspicion. Ilara's mind, now honed for strategic infiltration, saw the answer not in force, but in servitude. She had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible in plain sight, and now she would turn that skill into a weapon. She learned that a high-end catering company, Gourmet Provisions, had a contract to service the corporate offices in the building next door, and their delivery vans used the same loading bay as the storage facility. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. She spent a week crafting a flawless, believable resume, inventing a history of food service experience, and aced the interview with a performance of quiet competence that was, by now, second nature to her. She was hired. Her first day on the job was a masterclass in controlled tension. Dressed in the crisp black uniform of Gourmet Provisions, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu, the familiar costume of servitude, now a disguise for a saboteur. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she helped unload crates of artisanal cheeses and expensive champagne into the loading bay, her eyes scanning every detail of the facility's layout, memorizing the locations of the cameras, the timing of the security guards' patrols, the digital keypad that controlled access to the storage corridors. She was a ghost in the machine, her mind a silent recorder, absorbing the critical data she would need. Arthur waited blocks away in his beat-up sedan, a nervous wreck, listening to a police scanner and praying she wouldn't be caught. He had given her the strategy, but the execution, the sheer nerve it required, was all hers. He was astounded by her transformation, from a quiet, grieving victim to a fearless, calculating operative. She was no longer just fighting for her father, she was reclaiming her own power, piece by piece. The opportunity came on her third day. A large corporate luncheon meant a chaotic delivery schedule, with staff moving back and forth from the van to the service elevator, creating a window of distraction. As her colleagues were preoccupied with a heavy trolley of food, Alara slipped away, her movements fluid and purposeful. She carried an empty catering crate, her prop to make her look like she belonged. She walked with a confidence she did not feel, her pulse a frantic drum in her ears. She reached the keypad for the third-floor corridor, her fingers hovering over the numbers. Frank had given them the code, a sequence he remembered from years ago, praying that Bellini's sentimental arrogance meant he would never have bothered to change it. She took a breath and punched in the 6 digits. A small green light blinked on, and the heavy magnetic lock clicked open with a sound that was, to her ears, as loud as a gunshot. She slipped inside, the heavy door hissing shut behind her, plunging her into the silent, climate-controlled twilight of the corridor. She found the unit, number 317, its steel door indistinguishable from the dozens of others that lined the long, silent hall. The only difference was the lock, a heavy, old-fashioned brass padlock that looked ancient compared to the modern facility around it. Frank had warned her about this, Bellini's final, analog piece of security. Arthur had spent 2 days teaching her the basics of lockpicking, using a set he'd bought from a shady online store. Her hands, once skilled at wielding charcoal and paintbrushes, now held a tension wrench and a rake. They trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming significance of the moment. Everything, her father's justice, her family's honor, her own future, came down to this. The metallic clicks inside the lock were agonizingly slow. For a heart-stopping minute, she thought she had failed. Then, with a final, satisfying snap, the mechanism gave way. The lock sprang open. She was in. The air inside the unit was stale, thick with the smell of dust and time. It was small, barely a closet, and contained only a single ornate mahogany desk and a large, black, antique safe that looked like a relic from a gangster film. The combination, another piece of Bellini's predictable psychology, was the date his own father had arrived in America, a number Frank had been forced to memorize. Alara's fingers, slick with sweat, turned the heavy dial. Left, right, left. The tumblers fell into place with a deep, resonant thud. She pulled the heavy iron handle, and the door swung open with a low groan, revealing its contents. There they were. 3 large, black, leather-bound ledgers, their spines embossed with gold leaf. She lifted one out, its weight surprising, heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 ruined lives. She opened it to a random page, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a meticulous record of destruction, written in a neat, elegant script. Names of businesses, weekly payment amounts, dates. It was the unadulterated, irrefutable truth of Marco Bellini's bloody ascent. She found the page for Amber Creek. Her eyes scanned the familiar names of her childhood, the bakery on the corner, the family-owned pharmacy, the hardware store, and then she saw it. Vance Art and Supply. Beside it, a series of entries, a methodical, week-by-week documentation of their financial exsanguination. A cold, clarifying rage washed over her, so pure and so intense it felt like peace. This was it. The proof. The weapon. She carefully placed the ledgers into the empty catering crate, her movements now precise and efficient. She relocked the safe, closed the unit, and snapped the old padlock back into place, leaving everything exactly as she had found it. She slipped back out into the service corridor and walked calmly back to the loading bay, her crate now carrying the payload that would bring down an empire. No one had even noticed she was gone. She was, as always, invisible. But this time, her invisibility was not a shield. It was a dagger, held at the throat of a king who had no idea he was already dead. Back in Arthur's paper-filled apartment, the 3 ledgers lay open on the coffee table like sacred texts of an evil religion. The air crackled with a triumphant, nervous energy. They had the evidence, more concrete and damning than Arthur had ever dreamed of finding. They could go to the authorities, hand it all over. but they both knew that wasn't enough. Bellini's lawyers would bury it in motions, his connections would intimidate witnesses, and the story would die a quiet death in the back pages of the newspapers. Justice, they knew, needed more than just proof. It needed a stage. It needed an audience. It needed a moment of such profound public humiliation that Bellini's empire of fear and influence would crumble not from a legal attack, but from the inside out. As they plotted their next move, Arthur's phone buzzed with a tip from one of his few remaining contacts at the city paper. The irony was so perfect, so poetic, that it felt like an act of fate. Marco Bellini, the city's most ruthless predator, was to be the guest of honor at the annual Philanthropist of the Year Gala, celebrated for his generous contributions to the city's arts and culture. Ilara looked at Arthur, and a slow, determined smile spread across her face. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. She saw it all with perfect clarity. The grand ballroom of a five-star hotel, the stage, the adoring crowd of the city's elite, the giant projection screens that would hang on either side of the podium. It was a stage Bellini had built for himself, a monument to his own manufactured legitimacy, and she was going to burn it to the ground. She looked down at the ledger, at the entry for her family's store, her finger tracing the name that Marco Bellini had tried to erase from the world. The hunt was over. The final performance was about to be scripted. The setting would be his greatest triumph, the weapon would be his own meticulously kept history, and the architect of his downfall would be the invisible waitress he had dismissed, without a second thought. The curtain was about to rise on the final act. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a universe unto itself, a gilded cage where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their own reflections. The air hummed with a low, self-satisfied murmur, a symphony of quiet boasts and strategic flattery, all set against the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. The scent was a carefully curated blend of hothouse flowers, expensive perfume, and the faint, savory aroma of canapés that cost more per piece than Ilara earned in an hour. She moved through this opulent theater once again in the familiar guise of invisibility, a ghost in a black catering uniform. But tonight, the uniform was not a mark of servitude. It was camouflage. Her heart did not hammer with the anxiety of a servant. It beat with the slow, steady, cold rhythm of a demolition expert about to press the detonator. Every glittering chandelier, every tuxedoed titan of industry, every bejeweled woman laughing a little too loudly was part of the stage, a set she was about to tear down. She felt the weight of the small, encrypted USB drive in her pocket, a tiny piece of plastic that held the digital ghosts of Marco Bellini's entire criminal history, a key that would unlock the truth and bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. Her mind was a fortress of calm, the image of her father's tired eyes, a constant, unwavering beacon guiding her through this final treacherous act. Marco Bellini ascended the stage not as a man, but as an icon of his own creation. The spotlight followed him, bathing him in a warm, adoring glow that he accepted as his birthright. He moved with an unhurried confidence, the easy grace of a predator who knows he sits at the top of the food chain. He approached the podium, a masterpiece of polished mahogany, and smiled out at the sea of powerful faces, a king surveying his loyal subjects. His voice, when he began to speak, was a smooth, resonant baritone, the kind of voice that inspired confidence and masked a multitude of sins. He spoke of legacy, of the sacred duty of the successful to uplift the less fortunate. He painted a picture of himself as a benevolent patriarch of the city, a man who built not just skyscrapers, but futures. He mentioned the revitalization of Amber Creek, his voice dripping with false modesty, describing it as a project that had turned a forgotten blight into a vibrant community. As he spoke, Ilara, positioned near a side service entrance, felt a cold fury wash over her. His words were a desecration of her family's memory, a lie so profound it was almost a physical force. In her mind, she saw the ledger entry, the neat, elegant script that chronicled the slow, methodical destruction of that same community, and she knew the time had come. From across the room, hidden amongst the audio-visual technicians he had bribed, Arthur Pinter caught her eye. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. Ilara slipped away from her post, her movements so practiced and efficient that no one even noticed her departure. She made her way through a labyrinth of service corridors to a small, forgotten control room that overlooked the ballroom, a room whose access code she had acquired from a disgruntled technician for the price of a decent bottle of scotch. The laptop was already open, connected directly to the ballroom's main projection system. Her fingers, no longer trembling, hovered over the keyboard. She could hear Bellini's voice through the sound system, reaching the crescendo of his speech, a final, soaring tribute to his own magnanimity. She took one last, deep breath, the sterile, air-conditioned scent of the control room filling her lungs. She thought of Leo's smile, of her father's stolen laughter, and she pressed enter. The world outside the small window of the control booth held its breath, poised on the brink of a cataclysm she was about to unleash. On the two massive screens flanking the stage, the professionally produced slideshow of Bellini's philanthropic endeavors abruptly vanished. The images of smiling children and gleaming new community centers were replaced by a single, stark, high-resolution image. It was a scanned page from a leather-bound ledger, the paper yellowed with age, the script an elegant, flowing cursive. At the top of the page, the heading was brutally clear: Amber Creek Weekly Collections. Bellini caught mid-sentence, faltered. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. His eyes darted to the screen, his polished smile freezing, then cracking at the edges. The image changed, zooming in on a single-line entry, Vance Art and Supply, followed by a series of numbers that documented a family's ruin. The screen changed again, this time to a photograph of a man in his prime, his face split by a joyous, booming laugh, his arms splattered with paint. It was David Vance, Ilara's father, in the doorway of his store, a ghost from a life Bellini had erased. The crowd was silent now, the air thick with a dawning collective horror. The final image was the most devastating of all. It was not a document or a photograph of a victim, but a simple, delicate drawing made with a ballpoint pen on a linen napkin. It was the world she and Leo had created: the bird, the tree, the moon, and the two small figures holding hands at the door of a house. It was a testament to a connection so pure and human that it served as the ultimate indictment of the cold, transactional world Bellini had built. He stared at the drawing, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning comprehension. The waitress, the boy. It all came crashing down on him. At that moment, a voice cut through the suffocating silence of the ballroom, amplified by the sound system. It was not a shout, but a clear, calm, and unshakable voice, emanating from a house microphone near the back of the room. Ilara stepped out of the shadows, still in her uniform, a symbol of all the people he had deemed invisible. Her eyes locked on his across the vast, silent expanse. She held the microphone, her hand as steady as a rock, and delivered the final, devastating blow to his carefully constructed universe. "True legacies are not built on what you own, Mr. Bellini," she said, her voice echoing in the gilded hall. "They are built on who you protect." The silence shattered. A wave of chaos erupted as the truth, in its raw and undeniable form, crashed over the assembled elite. The flashbulbs of the press corps, who had been invited to document a coronation, now began to fire with a predatory frenzy, capturing a public execution. Men who had shaken Bellini's hand minutes before now scrambled away from him as if he were radioactive, their faces pale with the terror of association. Bellini stood frozen on the stage, the spotlight that had once been his ally, now a harsh, unforgiving interrogator's lamp, exposing every crack in his crumbling facade. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to threaten, but no words came out. His power, which had always resided in the fear and deference of others, had evaporated in an instant. Just then, The grand doors of the ballroom burst open, not with late-arriving guests, but with a dozen stone-faced federal agents, their movements calm, efficient, and final. Arthur Pinter had made his call the moment the first ledger page appeared on screen. As two agents ascended the stage, their purpose clear, Marco Bellini's entire world imploded. The arrogance, the control, the invincibility, it all collapsed, leaving only a hollowed-out man, utterly and irrevocably defeated, a titan turned to dust under the weight of a single, forgotten napkin. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. 6 months later, the world smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and hope. The Vance Institute for Art and Communication was not a grand, imposing structure, but a warm, sun-drenched space in a converted downtown loft, its walls covered not in expensive art, but in the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful creations of children. After the gala, the story of the waitress who toppled an empire had become a city legend. A quiet, unassuming philanthropist, the head of a major national arts foundation who had been in the audience that night, had sought her out. He hadn't seen an avenger, he had seen a visionary. He saw in her actions the practical application of a powerful, revolutionary idea, that art was a fundamental language of the human soul. He gave her the funding and the freedom to build her dream from the ashes of her past. Now, Ilara spent her days not serving the powerful, but empowering the voiceless. She knelt on the floor, her clothes comfortably stained with paint, guiding the hand of a young, nonverbal girl, helping her draw a brilliant yellow sun, a silent conversation of color and shape that spoke volumes. On a large screen mounted to the wall, a live video feed showed a man in a comfortable, sunlit room at the city's best long-term care facility. It was her father. His recovery had been slow, but with the pressure of the bills gone and his daughter's happiness a daily presence in his life, a light had returned to his eyes. He watched her work, a slow, peaceful smile gracing his lips. The cycle of destruction had been broken and replaced with a cycle of creation. Alara had not only reclaimed her family's honor, she had resurrected its legacy, transforming the simple joy of their small art supply store into a powerful force for good that would touch thousands of lives. On her desk, amidst the happy clutter of crayons and sketchbooks, sat a small, simple frame. Inside it, protected under glass, was the linen napkin, the drawing she and Leo had made together. It was a constant reminder that the most profound acts of rebellion can begin with the quietest acts of kindness, and that the strongest empires can be dismantled not by weapons or armies, but by the simple, unwavering courage of someone who refuses to be invisible any longer. Her journey had taken her through the darkest valleys of grief and servitude, but it had led her here, to a place of purpose, a place where her unique gift was not a secret weapon, but a beacon, shining a light for all the lost and silent children of the world, helping them, one drawing at a time, to find their way home. If Alara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.